Imagine growing up in a world where your every breath, blink, and word was ruled by bizarre traditions, where a wrong smile could get you whipped and sneezing in class could summon a priest. From Victorian England's silent classrooms to Japan's no left-handed writing laws, and even 19th century America's fear-based obedience camps, history is filled with parenting and school rules so strange they seem almost fictional. Today, we're diving into 50 of the strangest, most unbelievable childhood laws humanity ever created. 1. In 17th century Scotland, children were forbidden to laugh during church or schooling, literally. If a child smiled during sermons or classroom prayers, their parents paid a fine or faced public whipping. Ministers called laughter a sound of Satan, claiming joy distracted from divine obedience. In some parishes, wooden guilt masks were forced onto children caught giggling, a cold metal punishment meant to freeze the devil's humor. Childhood joy itself became an offense against heaven. 2. In Meiji-era Japan, late 1800s, left-handed writing was banned in schools. Teachers tied children's left arms to their bodies so they couldn't use them. Using the left hand was considered unpatriotic, a sign of moral weakness. Parents were urged to retrain their children through nightly drills, sometimes striking the disobedient hand with bamboo rods. The policy aimed to enforce social uniformity, every stroke of ink becoming a symbol of collective discipline, not individuality. 3. During Tsarist Russia's 19th century, noble families sent children to military academies at age 6. Their heads were shaved, voices silenced, and affection outlawed. Parents were forbidden to visit for years. The idea was to temper the will by erasing softness entirely. Some academies kept boys in silent meals for entire months, rewarding only emotionless obedience. Graduates emerged as elite officers, but often unable to hug their mothers without trembling. 4. In Puritan New England, around 1650, every child was required by law to memorize entire passages of the Bible or be whipped. Parents who failed to enforce this faced imprisonment for spiritual negligence. Town inspectors knocked on doors unannounced, testing children's scripture memory. The punishment for forgetting verses wasn't mild. Children were flogged publicly for the good of their souls. Learning was measured not in knowledge but in fear and pain. 5. In early 1900s, Germany, Schwarze Pädagogik, black pedagogy, ruled parenting. Manuals taught parents to break a child's will before age 5. Mothers were told never to comfort crying infants. Crying was the devil's manipulation. Schools reinforced obedience with humiliation. Children forced to wear donkey ears for mistakes or sleep in dark closets for laziness. The system bred generations of rigid, emotionally stunted adults who mistook cruelty for strength. 6. In Victorian England, the penny dreadful panic led schools to search students' bags for forbidden storybooks. Authorities believed cheap horror tales would rot moral tissue. If caught reading one, students were forced to copy moral essays 100 times or spend hours in reflection closets, tiny wooden boxes barely big enough to sit in. Some teachers even burned confiscated books before the class, calling it a purification of imagination. 7. In 18th century China, elite tutors practiced education through silence. A child who spoke without permission lost food for the day. Speaking before elders was considered an intellectual sin. Some academies trained boys to hold stones in their mouths for hours to learn restraint. Parents paid fortunes to ensure sons became quiet as jade. Those who resisted were dismissed as unrefined beasts, unfit for scholarship or marriage. 8. In 1950s America, a wave of cold parenting advice from psychologists like John B. Watson told parents never to hug or kiss their children. Watson warned affection would weaken moral fiber. Mothers were instructed to shake hands with toddlers each morning and maintain emotional distance. Many children of this era later reported feeling raised by strangers, growing up in houses filled with toys, rules, and silence, but no warmth. 9. In 16th century France, the glass discipline was a bizarre classroom ritual. Students were told the teacher's gaze could shatter them, like glass if they disobeyed. To enforce it, teachers carried actual glass rods and smashed them during lessons to terrify students. Fear replaced respect. Children whispered prayers before entering school, believing even blinking might break the invisible pain of order. Education became a theater of trembling obedience. Among the Maasai of Kenya during the early 1900s, boys entering warrior training were forbidden from showing pain. Ever. Even during circumcision ceremonies, if a boy flinched, his entire family was shamed and exiled for dishonor. Children learned to bite their tongues until they bled rather than cry. The rule created a culture of endurance so fierce it bordered on inhuman, teaching boys that silence was survival and emotion was weakness. In 19th century Ireland, children attending Catholic boarding schools were forced to sleep with their hands above the blankets every night. Nuns patrolled dormitories with candles, ready to strike any child who moved suspiciously. The rule was meant to suppress impure thoughts. Some schools even tied children's wrists to bedposts. It wasn't just discipline, it was control of the body and mind. Many grew up haunted, associating sleep itself with guilt and punishment. In Sparta, around 600 BCE, babies were inspected by the state within days of birth. If deemed weak, they were thrown into the ravine of Mount Taygetus. Those allowed to live faced brutal agoge training, starved, beaten, and forbidden from crying. Parents had no right to intervene. The child belonged to the state. Spartan childhood wasn't about growth. It was a military test of endurance designed to breed warriors, not humans. In early 1800s England, chimney sweep apprentices were often children as young as 5, sold by their parents. A rule of gratitude demanded that no child could complain or cry while cleaning narrow, soot-filled chimneys. If they did, masters lit fires beneath them to teach bravery. Many suffocated. Parents were told this labor built character. Childhood became a climb through darkness, literally and morally. In 1930s Soviet Russia, teachers enforced Lenin's rule of silence. Students were forbidden to whisper in class or discuss personal beliefs. Even talking about family at school was dangerous. Children were encouraged to report parents who criticized the regime. Betrayal was praised as patriotic maturity. Some children turned in their own mothers to prove loyalty. The classroom became an arena where affection and fear wrestled in every mind. In medieval monasteries across Europe, boys training to become monks followed the rule of thorns. They were whipped for speaking during meals, for laughing, even for dreaming too loudly. One abbey in France required boys to walk barefoot on thorns while reciting prayers for humility. The logic: suffering purifies the soul. Childhood was seen as something to be beaten out, a sinful fire that had to be extinguished through pain. In 19th century Japan, samurai children practiced the Night of the Ghost Lanterns. Fathers would send them into forests with a single candle and no escort. They were forbidden to return until sunrise. The purpose was to train courage through terror. Some children fainted or got lost, but the shame of returning early was worse. Fear became a classroom, and the dark a teacher more feared than death itself. In 1600s, Switzerland, the Protestant city of Zurich, banned fairy tales for children entirely. Parents caught telling stories about magic or ghosts could be fined or imprisoned. Officials believed imagination opened the gates to heresy. Instead, children were made to memorize moral codes and confession lists. Dreaming was considered dangerous, a mental crime. Childhood curiosity was replaced by the dull rhythm of recitation and repentance. In 18th century Ottoman Turkey, elite schools forced students to wear iron collars engraved with verses from the Quran. These collars were heavy and children slept in them. The belief was that the word must rest upon the flesh. Teachers told students that removing the collar without permission would curse their families. Learning became a literal burden, devotion through discomfort, holiness through suffocation. In 1910s America, several experimental schools adopted behavioral conditioning methods inspired by early psychology. Students were rewarded with candy for silence and shocked by mild electric currents for speaking out of turn. Teachers justified it as science-based discipline. The children learned obedience not through understanding, but through fear of invisible pain. It was education reduced to a laboratory experiment where curiosity itself was treated as a flaw. In Victorian orphanages of London, children were forced to eat oatmeal laced with soap as punishment for dishonesty or gluttony. The rule came from a belief that moral impurity could be cleansed from within. Some caretakers washed children's mouths with lye for lying. Many orphans developed stomach burns or lifelong aversions to food. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was weaponized to erase shame through suffering. In ancient Rome, the pater familias, the father, had absolute legal power over his children, including the right to kill them. Under the law of the 12 tables, if a son disobeyed, the father could sell him into slavery 3 times before execution was permitted. Even adult men needed paternal consent for marriage or trade. Family affection was secondary to dominance. Roman childhood was not about nurture. It was an apprenticeship in submission to authority, beginning and ending with fear. In 19th century France, rural boarding schools used the bucket rule. Students weren't allowed nighttime bathroom breaks. Instead, 1 bucket served 30 boys. Speaking, laughing, or missing the bucket meant caning at dawn. Teachers claimed it taught restraint and self-control. The stench filled dormitories, yet no one dared complain. Many children developed infections, but complaints were labeled weakness of will. Hygiene, humiliation, and obedience fused into one twisted lesson of endurance. In North Korea during the 1970s, children were required to bow to portraits of Kim Il-sung every morning and night. Even in their own homes, parents who failed to ensure this ritual were accused of ideological neglect. Teachers inspected homes for dust on the leader's image, punishing both child and family. Love, faith, and fear became indistinguishable. The cult of obedience began before literacy. Children learned loyalty before they learned language. In 18th century Sweden, children in poor parishes were forced into beggar schools. Each child carried a wooden token marking them as an official beggar for the church. They had to collect food from door to door while reciting prayers for donors. If they forgot the words, they went hungry. It was called moral charity, teaching humility through public shame. Education and humiliation were braided into survival. In 1960s China, during the Cultural Revolution, students were ordered to publicly denounce their teachers and parents. School assemblies became theatrical purges, children shouting accusations against elders while waving red books. Some teachers were beaten by their own pupils. It was called revolutionary cleansing. Love turned to fear overnight. The bond between generations, once sacred, was replaced by suspicion. The classroom became a political battlefield, drenched in betrayal. In medieval Italy, noble families trained sons in table discipline. During feasts, boys were forced to sit perfectly still for hours, forbidden from scratching or blinking excessively. Servants observed them with switches ready to strike for any lapse. The rule symbolized noble restraint. A single sneeze could ruin a child's social standing. Meals became silent trials of dignity, where etiquette mattered more than hunger or comfort. In 19th century Prussia, a rule known as the Bell of Repentance governed classrooms. Whenever a student erred, the teacher rang a brass bell. The offender stood with it tied around their neck all day. The sound marked shame. Every movement, every step reminded them of their failure. Children dreaded the faintest chime. Discipline wasn't just external. It echoed literally inside their ears. In ancient Sparta's female schools, often forgotten in history, girls were trained to endure pain equal to men. One ritual required running barefoot through thorn fields. Another forced them to hold burning coals while reciting patriotic hymns. Parents cheered from the sidelines, the purpose to breed mothers strong enough to birth warriors. Even tenderness was militarized. The cradle and the battlefield shared the same blood. In 17th century Austria, a strange rule in rural monasteries banned children from smiling at animals. Monks believed it invited the devil's spirit through affection. If caught petting a cat or dog, children were made to fast for days. Some monasteries even executed stray animals seen near classrooms. Compassion itself was treated as sin. A child's instinct for kindness became the very thing they had to suppress. In 1930s Germany, under Nazi youth training, children were forbidden to play imaginative games. Toys like dolls or fantasy figures were banned, seen as weakening the Aryan spirit. Only miniature weapons, soldiers, and marching exercises were permitted. Teachers measured patriotism by how rigidly a child stood at attention. Creativity was replaced by conformity. Even playtime was militarized, a rehearsal for the war that awaited them. In 16th century Denmark, a law called the Parents' Rod Ordinance mandated that fathers publicly whip their own children once a year to remind them of obedience. Markets hosted these ceremonies as moral entertainment. Children as young as 4 were paraded, beaten lightly or harshly depending on temperament. Authorities claimed it strengthened family unity. For many, it only created lifelong fractures, turning love into ritualized pain and fatherhood into theater of cruelty sanctioned by faith. In early 20th century America, silent lunches were enforced in many industrial town schools. Children were forbidden from speaking or even looking around during meals. Inspectors walked with stopwatches, 3 minutes per course. The purpose was efficiency training, preparing them for factory life. Violators scrubbed floors afterward. Meals lost their warmth, becoming mechanical drills of time, motion, and obedience. Childhood itself was repurposed as a rehearsal for labor discipline. 33. In 15th century Japan, Buddhist temple schools made children copy sutras using ink mixed with their own blood. Tiny finger pricks filled the inkstone. Teachers said the sacrifice helped them write with sincerity. Those who refused were labeled spiritually impure. Some fainted mid-practice. The ritual blurred devotion and suffering. Writing became a sacred wound, and childhood faith was written literally in blood. In colonial India, British mission schools forced Indian children to sing Christian hymns daily before classes. Refusal or hesitation meant caning. Speaking native languages on campus was forbidden, punishable by kneeling on gravel or holding bricks overhead for hours. The rule aimed to civilize through suppression. For millions, childhood became a daily act of self-erasure, where identity itself was trained out of them word by word. In 17th century Holland, poor children apprenticed under sleep masters were forced to sleep standing upright as punishment for laziness. Ropes tied under their arms prevented collapse. The method supposedly cured sloth. Some children developed spinal injuries. Town elders praised it as moral correction, believing sleep comfort corrupted the soul. Even rest became regulated, as if mercy itself required punishment to be pure. In early 1900s Canada, Indigenous children in residential schools were punished for speaking their native tongues. Soap filled their mouths, or needles pierced their tongues, to cleanse impurity. Teachers called it civilization therapy. Generations lost language, identity, and warmth under smiling portraits of the Queen. The rule was not just discipline, it was cultural amputation disguised as education, a wound that still bleeds through memory and silence. In 18th century Poland, aristocratic tutors used the ink starvation rule. Students weren't allowed to refill ink until their work was flawless. One mistake, and they wrote with dry pens until their pages tore. The goal was to teach precision, but it taught despair instead. Children sobbed quietly as words faded mid-sentence, punished by emptiness itself. Perfection became pain, and learning turned to torture by patience. In early 1900s, South Korea, Confucian family schools required children to bow before ancestors' tablets 50 times each morning. Skipping even one bow invited caning. Parents monitored each gesture for sincerity. Some children fainted mid-ritual but were forced to continue to prove piety. The belief, respect measured through exhaustion, brings virtue. Childhood reverence became an act of physical submission. Faith proved through bruised knees and tears. In 1700s England, upper-class schools enforced the silence duel. Two boys caught whispering were forced to stare at each other in silence for hours, hands bound. The first to speak received a public beating. Teachers called it a test of willpower. Children learned not just silence but suspicion. Friendship became dangerous, a potential trap that could end in humiliation. Social connection was slowly conditioned out of them. In Aztec Mexico, children in the Telpochcali, the warrior school, were punished by having chili smoke blown into their eyes for disobedience. The pain was excruciating but brief, meant to purify the spirit. Parents approved, believing it made children stronger. Even mothers performed this at home to teach humility. The rule embodied a strange love, affection through agony, teaching that pain is both punishment and preparation for honor. In 18th century France, the mirror rule in convent schools forced girls to stare into mirrors for hours while nuns listed their sins aloud. They were told to watch the reflection of their shame. Some fainted from humiliation. Teachers believed self-hatred would breed obedience. The mirror became a weapon of moral correction. Beauty turned into guilt, and childhood vanity into a battlefield for control. Reflection wasn't about self-awareness, but self-erasure through endless staring. In 19th century Scotland, some rural schools practiced the cold water cure. Children late for class were forced to plunge their hands into freezing buckets and hold them until numb. It was believed to refresh the lazy. During winters, ice floated in the pails, fingers cracked and bled, but complaints were mocked as weakness. The rule was simple: pain awakens discipline. Yet many children left school fearing both knowledge and kindness. In medieval Persia, royal tutors enforced the silence of breath. Princes were trained to control even their breathing while elders spoke. If they exhaled audibly, punishment followed, a strike with a reed cane. The rules symbolized divine respect for authority. Some boys practiced holding breath until their vision blurred. It wasn't education. It was transformation into statues of restraint, where stillness equaled virtue and oxygen became a privilege of obedience. In 1930s Italy under Mussolini, children were forced to wear miniature military uniforms to school. Teachers inspected posture, salute, and gait every morning. A crooked elbow meant extra drills after class. Even girls were taught to march with fascist grace. Parents who refused participation risked losing jobs. The classroom became a parade ground, education reduced to choreography of loyalty, every pencil stroke an act of political devotion. In 18th century Hungary, children were made to wear sin stones around their necks, heavy rocks inscribed with their confessed misdeeds. They carried them all day, even during lessons. The rule came from Jesuit influence. Physical burden equals moral redemption. Some stones weighed several kilograms. Children staggered through corridors of piety, learning to associate guilt with gravity. Sin became something you could feel pressing against your bones. In 1920s America, the good posture movement swept schools. Children were drilled to sit with perfect backs for hours, wooden rulers strapped to their spines. Inspectors walked rows with measuring sticks. Slouching was labeled moral decay. Some schools tied heads to ceiling cords to prevent bending. It was less about health and more about conformity, bodies trained to match the nation's ideal of discipline and order. In 17th century Russia, a strange superstition banned children from playing with shadows. The Orthodox Church warned that darkness mimics demons. Parents punish kids who chase their silhouettes, sometimes washing them with holy water afterward. The rule aimed to protect innocence from unseen temptations. But for children, it erased wonder, turning sunlight and imagination into sins whispered by superstition. Even joy became a spiritual threat. In 19th century Victorian orphanages, children were punished through window meals. Food was placed outside on a ledge, and the child forced to watch it until the rest finished eating. Only then could they eat the cold scraps. Matrons called it lesson of gratitude. Hunger was weaponized into reflection, forcing children to stare at denial. It taught not manners, but the cruel art of earning permission to exist. In 1600s Japan, certain Buddhist schools had the silence bell. Students meditated for hours in freezing halls. Anyone who coughed or moved caused the bell to ring, and everyone, not just the offender, was struck. The shared suffering enforced collective awareness. Children learned that one mistake meant everyone's pain. The rule crushed individuality, but birthed an eerie unity born of fear, harmony through mutual punishment, discipline by shared dread. In 18th century England, noble families practiced sleep education. Servants whispered moral lessons into children's ears as they slept. warnings about greed, obedience, and chastity. Parents believed the subconscious could be trained like muscle. Some children woke screaming, haunted by voices in dreams they didn't understand. It was an early experiment in psychological control, shaping virtue through sleep, turning innocence into an open channel for manipulation masked as love.